All right, here we are, 1st and 2nd Kings for beginners. That's the name of our series, subtitled The Kings Who Ruled and Ruined Israel. And we're talking about the divided kingdom in this second lesson on this series. And today, hopefully, we'll cover chapters 12 to 22 in 1 Kings. I just want to remind you once again about our workbooks for this particular class. You can get those on the BibleTalk.tv website. Very handy. You've got all the charts, all the maps, everything's in the student workbook. So I encourage you to pick one up to have a better experience of the class itself. All right. So as we transition from 1 Kings into 2 Kings, the story of Israel continues to unfold with the familiar themes of leadership, faithfulness, and divine judgment. While 1 Kings chronicles the rise and fall of King Solomon and the division of the United Kingdom into Israel in the north and Judah in the south, 2 Kings picks up with the ongoing struggles of both nations under a series of kings, many of whom lead their people further away from God. The prophets, particularly Elijah and his successor Elisha, play a pivotal role in calling the kings and the people back to repentance, while God's judgment looms over their present and persistent disobedience. The narrative in 2 Kings moves towards the inevitable destruction of both Israel and Judah, marking the end of their independence and the beginning of exile for the people. But it also points to God's unwavering sovereignty over history. No matter what they do, God is still present, God is still directing things. And so the first section here we talk about in 1 Kings chapter 12 to 14, we see that Jeroboam's life and the events in 1 Kings chapters 12 and 13, this information marks a critical turning point in the history of Israel. Jeroboam, originally a servant of King Solomon, became the first king of the newly formed northern kingdom of Israel after the division of the united monarchy. God had promised him leadership over the 10 northern tribes due to Solomon's unfaithfulness. However, despite this divine opportunity, Jeroboam's reign is characterized by disobedience and idolatry. We find out that the chapter begins with the people of Israel asking Rehoboam, Solomon's son and his successor in Judah, to lighten the heavy burdens imposed by his father, tax burdens actually. Instead of listening to the elders' wise counsel to lighten the tax load on the people, Rehoboam follows the advice of his younger peers, and he threatens to increase their labor, which causes a rebellion among the people. And so as a result, 10 of the 12 tribes reject Rehoboam and proclaim Jeroboam as king over Israel, thus dividing the kingdom into the northern kingdom of Israel under Jeroboam and the southern kingdom of Judah under Rehoboam. Fearing that his people would return to Jerusalem to worship at the temple, Jeroboam, the king of the north, devises a plan to secure his power over his people. He makes 2 golden calves and places them in Bethel and Dan. If you notice on your map, you have Bethel, you see there in the green portion at the bottom part, the southern part of the northern kingdom, Bethel, and then way at the top, the city of Dan. And he tells the people, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. That's in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 28. And so Jeroboam establishes a kind of a rival religious system, appointing non-Levite priests and creating new festivals in order to keep the Israelites in the north from going to the south in order to worship at the temple, or rather to worship in the city of Jerusalem. This act of idolatry sets the tone for the rest of his reign and leads Israel into spiritual corruption. And so in chapter 13, a prophet from Judah, often referred to as a man of God, is sent by God to Bethel in order to confront Jeroboam during one of his false worship ceremonies. The prophet boldly declares that a future king named Josiah will arise and destroy these idolatrous altars and priests. However, Jeroboam does not repent of his idolatry. The chapter continues with the story of this prophet's disobedience to God, and then despite being warned by God not to eat or drink in Bethel, the prophet is deceived by an old prophet from Bethel and accepts his invitation to share a meal. This act of disobedience leads the man of God to be killed by a lion on his way home. And we see that this tragic event serves as a warning about the consequences of disobeying God's commands, even for prophets. They had to obey as well. And so Jeroboam, here's the graphic where you see on the overhead, and in your workbooks, you have a graphic that provides the name of the king, his kingdom, information about the king and how his reign ended. And we'll be showing you these as we discuss the different kings. So as far as Jeroboam is concerned, he began as a leader chosen by God to rule over the northern tribes of Israel, but his fear of losing power led him to sin by establishing idolatrous worship practices and places. And despite warnings from prophets, Jeroboam did not turn from his sinful ways. His actions set a precedent of idolatry and disobedience that plagued the northern kingdom of Israel throughout its entire history. Jeroboam's reign marks the beginning of Israel's spiritual decline, and he is remembered as the king who caused Israel to sin. Chapter 14 describes key events in the reigns of both Jeroboam, king of Israel, and Rehoboam, king of Judah. It focuses on the consequences of their disobedience to God and the resulting judgments on both of these kings and their kingdoms. Then there is the account of the illness of Jeroboam's son. Jeroboam's son, Abijah, falls gravely ill, and Jeroboam, concerned for his child, sends his wife in disguise to the prophet Ahijah in Shiloh. Jeroboam hopes to receive good news about his son's condition. However, Ahijah, though blind due to old age, recognizes Jeroboam's wife immediately because the Lord had revealed her coming and the true reason for her visit. Ahijah delivers a devastating message from God. He condemns Jeroboam for leading Israel into idolatry, worshiping golden calves, and turning away from God's commandments. After this, God's judgment is pronounced. Jeroboam's dynasty will be completely destroyed, and all his male descendants will be killed. Ahijah also declares that Abijah, the ill son, will die as soon as Jeroboam's wife returns to the city. This child, however, will be the only one in Jeroboam's family to receive a proper burial, as God saw something good in him. And true to the prophecy, Abijah dies as soon as his mother steps into the house, and the people of Israel mourn for him. And so Jeroboam's continued idolatry brings about a severe judgment, leading to the eventual downfall of his dynasty. His refusal to repent demonstrates how idolatry can corrupt an entire nation as well as its leaders. This event sets the stage for the turbulent future of the northern kingdom of Israel, which would be plagued by political instability as well as a divine punishment. We continue to read about the death of Jeroboam. This chapter briefly mentions his death. After ruling for 22 years, he dies, and his son Nadab succeeds him as king. Jeroboam's legacy is one of sin, and his name becomes synonymous with leading Israel into idolatry. Jeroboam's reign establishes a pattern of disobedience and idolatry that subsequent kings in Israel would follow. His failure as a leader causes lasting spiritual and political harm to the northern kingdom. Meanwhile, Rehoboam in the north, Solomon's son, reigns in Judah. Rehoboam's rule is marked by the nation's moral and spiritual decline as well. The people of Judah engage in idolatry, building high places and sacred pillars and Asherah poles, and practicing detestable customs, including male shrine prostitution, similar to the pagan nations around them. I mean, this is where they got the ideas to do this type of idolatry. This, of course, marks a significant departure from the worship of the true God. Rehoboam's failure to lead Judah in faithfulness to God results in widespread corruption and idolatry. Judah begins to mirror the sinful practices of the surrounding nations, which would later bring God's judgment on them as well. Now, in the 5th year of Rehoboam's reign, King Shishak of Egypt invades Judah. Shishak eventually plunders the treasures of the temple of the Lord and the royal palace, Solomon's royal palace, taking all of the gold shields that Solomon had made for the palace. To replace these, Rehoboam makes bronze shields, which are much less valuable, of course. These shields are used when he enters the temple, but they symbolize the decline of Judah's former glory under Solomon. And so the invasion by Shishak is a direct consequence of Judah's unfaithfulness to God. The loss of the temple treasures represents the erosion of Judah's spiritual and material wealth, signaling a decline from the golden age of Solomon to a period of vulnerability and weakness towards other nations around them. You remember when David was king, other nations paid tribute to Israel. They brought gold and silver and all kinds of things that David stored for the building of the temple. Now under Rehoboam, other nations are coming in and removing the wealth that had been stored in the capital city, both political and spiritual capital of Israel. The chapter concludes with a brief account of Rehoboam's death. After reigning for 17 years, he dies. He's buried in Jerusalem, the city chosen by God for his name. His son Abijam, a form of the name Abijah, we read about that in 2 Chronicles chapter 13. So Abijam succeeds him as king and reigns only 3 years before he dies and is succeeded by his son Asa. We're going to talk about Asa in a moment. Now, the chapter notes that there was constant warfare between Rehoboam and Jeroboam throughout their reigns, further illustrating the division and conflict between Israel and Judah. Remember, it was one country, they were united. Now it's divided into two and they're fighting among themselves. Rehoboam's reign in the south is marked by failure, both in terms of spiritual leadership and political stability. His death symbolizes the ongoing decline of the Davidic dynasty in Judah, with the kingdom becoming more spiritually corrupt and politically unstable. We move on to chapter 14. This chapter highlights the devastating effects of disobedience and idolatry in both Israel and Judah. Jeroboam's idolatry leads to the eventual destruction of his own dynasty, while Rehoboam's failure to lead Judah in righteousness brings about military defeat as well as spiritual decline. Both kingdoms suffer from their leaders' failure to follow God's commands, leading to a weakening of their political power and a growing distance from the Lord. The chapter serves as a sobering reminder of the consequences of turning away from God's guidance and going into other forms of religion, religious practice and idolatry. Chapter 15 of Kings, 1 Kings, talks about Asa and his particular reign. Asa became king of Judah following the death of his father Abijam. Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, much like King David. He removed the pagan idols, he banished the male shrine prostitutes, he deposed his own grandmother, Maacah, from her position as queen because of her idolatry. Read about that in 1 Kings 15, 9-13. Although Asa did not remove all the high places, his heart was fully committed to the Lord throughout his reign. Asa brought silver, gold, and other valuable items into the temple. kind of reversing that trend. Instead of losing, they were now gaining once again. And he didn't build up wealth for himself, but dedicated all of this treasure to the Lord. Baasha, king of Israel, the north, fortified Ramah, a crucial city. He fortified that city to block Judah's access. Asa responded by sending the temple and the royal treasures to Ben-Hadad, who was the king of Aram, to form an alliance with him in order to pressure Baasha to withdraw. Ben-Hadad attacked Israel's northern cities, forcing Baasha to stop building at the city of Ramah. After Baasha's withdrawal, Asa used the materials from Ramah to strengthen the cities of Geba and Mizpah. Asa ruled Judah for a long time, 41 years. Toward the end of his reign, he suffered from a severe foot disease, but relied more on physicians than seeking the Lord. He eventually died and was buried with his ancestors in the city of David, chapter 15, verses 23 and 24. King Asa's reign is remembered for his faithfulness to God, his religious reforms, and his military diplomacy. In 1 Kings chapter 16, we see the rapid succession of kings in the northern kingdom of Israel, their sinful reigns, and God's judgment and punishment against them. The chapter highlights political instability and deepening idolatry during this particular period. And so it begins with a judgment on Baasha. Baasha, who had assassinated King Nadab and took the throne, is condemned by God through the prophet Jehu. God judges Baasha for continuing in the idolatrous ways of Jeroboam, leading to a prophecy of the destruction of his dynasty, similar to Jeroboam's fate. Baasha reigns for 24 years, but his death brings no lasting peace. Elah, Baasha's son, rules for only 2 years before being assassinated by his military commander Zimri while he was drunk. Zimri seizes the throne. Zimri kills all of Baasha's descendants in order to fulfill the prophecy that Baasha would have no dynasty. But he reigns for only 7 days. The Israelite army stationed at Gibbethon proclaims their commander Omri as king. And so Zimri, realizing his defeat, sets fire to the royal palace and dies in the flames. After Zimri's death, a civil conflict ensues between Omri and another claimant, Tibni. Omri eventually prevails, becoming king of Israel and reigning for 12 years. Omri establishes Samaria as the new capital of Israel, a significant political move, but he continues in idolatry, doing more evil than all those before him. Omri's son Ahab becomes king, and he reigns for 22 years. Ahab is described as the most wicked king yet, exceeding the sins of all of his predecessors. He marries Jezebel, who was a Sidonian princess, and officially introduces Baal worship in Israel, building a temple for Baal in Samaria. Ahab's reign marks a significant deepening of Israel's idolatry and rebellion against God. And so 1 Kings chapter 16 highlights the increasingly sinful reigns of the kings of Israel and the political instability caused by the assassinations and excessive civil war. God's judgment on the house of Baasha and the continued idolatry under Omri and Ahab sets the stage for future confrontations between the prophets of God and the leadership of Israel. In 1 Kings 17, we are introduced to the prophet Elijah, and this marks the beginning of his prophetic ministry during the reign of King Ahab of Israel. The chapter focuses on God's miraculous provision for Elijah and two very significant miracles. Elijah, the prophet, declares that there will be no rain in Israel except by his word, as a judgment from God due to Ahab's idolatry and Baal worship. Following the proclamation, God instructs Elijah to hide by the brook of Cherith. Ravens, we read about this, ravens miraculously bring him food, and he drinks from the brook until it dries up due to the drought. God then sends Elijah to Zarephath, where a widow provides him with food, even though she only has a small amount of flour and oil left. Elijah promises that her supplies will not run out, and indeed, God miraculously sustains them throughout the drought. The widow's son then falls ill and dies. Elijah prays to God, and the boy is miraculously raised from the dead. This event affirms the widow's belief that Elijah was truly a man of God. And so 1 Kings 18 continues the story of Elijah and features a dramatic showdown between Elijah and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, demonstrating God's power over the false god Baal. After 3 years of drought, God instructs Elijah to present himself to Ahab and announce that rain is coming. Elijah meets Obadiah, a faithful servant of God, and tells him to inform Ahab of his presence. Ahab accuses Elijah of causing trouble in Israel. However, Elijah counters that it is Ahab's idolatry that has brought the disaster and not Elijah's prophecy. And so Elijah challenges Ahab and the prophets of Baal to a contest on Mount Carmel to prove who is the true God. The people of Israel gather, and Elijah sets the terms. Each side will prepare a sacrifice, and the God who answers by fire will be the true God. And so the 450 prophets of Baal call on their God all day with no response. We see that Elijah actually mocks them, and then he prepares his own sacrifice. After praying to God, fire miraculously falls from heaven and consumes the entire sacrifice. I mean, the wood, the stones, even the water that had been poured over the altar. And so upon seeing this, the people of Israel acknowledge the Lord as the true God. And Elijah commands the people to seize the prophets of Baal, who were then executed. Elijah tells Ahab to prepare for rain. And so Elijah prays on the mountain, and after a series of prayers, a small cloud appears, and soon a heavy rain falls, ending the drought. Elijah, filled with God's power, runs ahead of Ahab's chariot all the way to Jezreel. And so 1 Kings 17 and 18 highlight Elijah's role as a powerful prophet of God, showcasing God's miraculous provision during the drought and his decisive victory over the false prophets of Baal. These chapters emphasize God's supremacy over false gods and sets the stage for further confrontations between Elijah and the corrupt rulers of Israel. In chapter 19, we see King Ahab, the 7th king of Israel, ruled during a period of significant political and spiritual turmoil. His reign is extensively covered in 1 Kings, especially from chapters 19 to 22, where his interactions with the prophet Elijah, his military campaigns, and his ultimate downfall are detailed. Ahab's reign is marked by idolatry, moral failure, and a series of confrontations with God's prophets. Elijah, at one point, flees from Jezebel. So after the dramatic victory over the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, King Ahab informs his wife Jezebel of what had happened. Jezebel, a devoted follower of Baal, vows to kill Elijah, and in fear Elijah flees into the wilderness. Despite Elijah's discouragement and flight, God sustains him and leads him to Mount Horeb, or Mount Sinai, where God speaks to Elijah in a small, still voice. God reassures Elijah, telling him to anoint new leaders, including Elisha as his prophetic successor. And he reveals to Elijah that there are 7,000 people in Israel who have remained faithful to God. That answer to Elijah's complaint that he was the last one, no one else was faithful. In chapter 20, we read about another king, Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, and you see on your map Aram there is in the northeastern section. Today we call it Syria. Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, besieges Samaria in the north, and he demands tribute from Ahab, including his wives, children, and wealth. Ahab initially agrees, but when Ben-Hadad demands more, Ahab refuses. Despite his idolatry, God sends a prophet to Ahab, promising victory over Ben-Hadad to demonstrate God's power. Ahab then wins a decisive victory against the Arameans in 2 major battles. After the second victory, Ahab captures Ben-Hadad, but makes a treaty with him instead of killing him as God had commanded. A prophet disguised as a wounded soldier rebukes Ahab for sparing Ben-Hadad, foretelling that Ahab's life would be taken in exchange for Ben-Hadad's. In Kings chapter 21, we see that Ahab desires a vineyard that is owned by Naboth, a righteous man in Jezreel. When Naboth refuses to sell or to trade his land, which is his family inheritance, Ahab sulks and refuses to eat. He pouts. We see Jezebel devising a plot to falsely accuse Naboth of blasphemy and treason. Naboth is unjustly stoned to death, and then Ahab takes possession of the vineyard. God sends Elijah to confront Ahab, proclaiming that Ahab's dynasty will be destroyed and that dogs will lick up his blood as they had done with Naboth, the righteous man. Elijah also foretells a violent death for Jezebel. Ahab, struck by the severity of the prophecy, surprisingly humbles himself and he begins to fast, which leads God to delay the destruction of his family until after Ahab's death. After 3 years of peace, Ahab seeks to reclaim Ramoth Gilead from the Arameans. He forms an alliance with Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, and they plan a joint military campaign. Ahab gathers about 400 prophets who all predict victory. However, Jehoshaphat asks if there is a prophet of the Lord to consult. Ahab reluctantly summons Micaiah, a prophet known for delivering unfavorable messages to him. Micaiah initially mocks the other prophets, but eventually delivers a true prophecy, predicting disaster for Ahab. He reveals a vision of God, sending a lying spirit to deceive Ahab's prophets, leading him to his death. Ahab, of course, ignores the warning and imprisons Micaiah for his trouble. In an attempt to avoid Micaiah's prophecy, Ahab disguises himself in battle while Jehoshaphat wears his royal robes, thereby being identified as a king. Despite the precautions, Ahab is struck by an arrow, mortally wounded. He dies later that evening. His body is brought back to Samaria, and as prophesied, the dogs lick up his blood where his chariot is washed. In chapter 22, we read about Ahab's son, Ahaziah, succeeding him as king of Israel. Ahaziah continues in the idolatrous practices of his parents, serving Baal and provoking God's anger. Ahab is remembered as one of the most wicked kings of Israel. His idolatry, spurred by his marriage to Jezebel, led Israel deeper into the worship of Baal. His reign was marked by constant conflict with God's prophet, particularly Elijah. Ahab's reign was one of spiritual decline and political instability for Israel. Despite military victories, his failure to lead Israel in the worship of the true God and his reliance on Jezebel's influence, all of these together led to his downfall. His reign ended in disaster, fulfilling the prophecies of Elijah, Micaiah, and his legacy continues to haunt Israel through their descendants. And there you have a brief survey overview of the material found in chapters 12 to 22 of 1 Kings. There are many lessons that we can draw from all parts of this material, but I've chosen 2 lessons in particular that have some significance for us today. first lesson is this: the consequences of poor leadership, or in other words, poor leadership has consequences. The story of Rehoboam, Solomon's son, refusing to listen to wise counsel and instead following the advice of his peers in 1 Kings 12, teaches the importance of seeking and applying wisdom in leadership decisions. Leaders, whether in the family or community or workplace, should listen to experienced voices and consider the broader impact of their choices. Ignoring wise counsel can lead to division, just as Rehoboam's decision caused the split of Israel into two kingdoms. And so we need to consider the advice that we receive carefully, especially when it comes from those with wisdom and experience. Humility in leadership is the key to maintaining unity. And then a second lesson from this material is the power of faithful obedience. The account of the prophet Elijah, particularly during the drought and his confrontation with the prophets of Baal, illustrates the power of faithful obedience to God, even in times of opposition. It's easy to be obedient when times are good. It's a little more difficult to be obedient when times are difficult, when we are challenged, if you wish. Elijah, for example, trusted God during a famine and boldly stood for God's truth despite being outnumbered. His obedience and faith led to God's miraculous intervention, providing food during the famine and, of course, the fire he called upon at Mount Carmel. Trust in God's provision and timing, even when circumstances seem overwhelming. Obedience to God brings about His intervention in powerful ways. Both of these lessons highlight the importance of wise leadership and faithfulness to God, especially in difficult times. All right, well, that's our lesson for today over chapters 12 to 22, 1 Kings. Here's our assignment. As always, I ask if you will take the time to reread this material now that we've covered it and given you some details about the events that take place. And then in preparation for our next lesson, read 2 Kings chapters 1 to 17 in preparation for our next lesson. That's it for today. Thank you for your attention. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.